38. Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
So our preacher today is the Reverend Laura Eberly. She'll be preaching in English, and then at the end, I will give a very short summary of her Word of God among many words that she will share with us.
So Jesus teaches us this strange paradox today. Those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for his sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Often this paradox gets framed as a message about self-denial. In order to be a good Christian, we have to suffer and be willing to sacrifice everything that matters to us. But I don't think that's actually the whole story. It doesn't square for me that Jesus is preaching self-denial and how lightly we ought to value our own lives. So what if instead this is a teaching about interconnectedness and how much our lives matter in the context of something much bigger than ourselves? This week we get these ancestral stories from Abraham and Paul about faith and inheritance. And so I've been thinking about ancestors and specifically about seventh generation thinking. Have any of you heard of seventh generation thinking before?
No.
No? So it's an indigenous idea that's attributed to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is also known as the Iroquois nations, that whenever you make decisions, you don't just think about yourself or your family or even your immediate community, you think about the impact on the next 7 generations.
Wow.
So that means your great, 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 great grandkids. Or if you think backwards, your great, 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 great grandparents. So if you go back 7 generations, your family tree starts to get huge.
Mm-hmm.
If you only count the 2 people whose DNA got together to make each descendant, then you have 112 7th generation direct ancestors. The lives of all of those 112 people went into making you. And if you start filling in the branches coming back down the tree with all their siblings and their marriages and all their siblings, suddenly you have thousands of people that you are related to by blood, whose lives, according to 7th generation thinking, have impacted yours. And this huge forest of roots and branches, I think, must have been what Abraham and Sarah had in mind when God promised to make them a multitude, the exceedingly fruitful parents of nations and kings. And then our reading from Paul draws the net even wider, right? Because the Roman Christians that Paul was writing to were probably not related to Abraham and Sarah by blood or race or ethnicity, or even by custom and culture and law. But Paul, our own ancestor in Christian faith, calls Abraham the father of them all, and by extension, us all. And I get that, right? As a queer person, I don't believe that biology makes family. family is a lot messier and more tangled up and more beautiful than just your DNA. And in this letter to the Romans, Paul lays claim to the validity of chosen family. He's saying that ancestry is determined by tradition, by practice, and by inheritance, at least as much as by biology, which is pretty cool. And that means that we are all descendants and inheritors of Abraham and Sarah's faith when hoping against hope they believed. This is gorgeous vision of interconnectedness that traces lines of faith, not only 7 generations, but millennia, to make a familial claim on each other as inheritors of the covenant God made with those ancestors and the ways that they faithfully lived into it. Which is a really nice story. But like a lot of the stories we tell about our ancestors, maybe a little cleaned up, maybe a little rose-colored, right? Because there's a more complicated story here, right? For Abraham and Sarah, Paul doesn't contend with their less faithful acts on their way to becoming parents, right? He skips that moment where Sarah arranges for Abraham to rape the enslaved Hagar, forcing Hagar to bear his child on her behalf. He skips that the faithful ancestral couple would later abandon Hagar and her son, and he doesn't talk about eventually Abraham being willing to sacrifice that hoped-for child, Isaac, to God. So ancestors can be complicated, and mine definitely are. These readings led me to look back a little bit at some of my own ancestral history, and it turns out that 2 of my great-great-great-grandfathers, so 5 generations back in my family, Peter Fesu Stevens and James Allen Latanay, were both bivocational Episcopal priests in the American South in the 1800s. And Stevens' other calling was to a military career as a colonel in the Confederate States Army. And Latanay's second vocation was as a plantation owner in Essex County, Virginia. Both of those ancestors of mine owned and traded enslaved people. They presided over large estates and were paid in tobacco for their pastoral duties. By all accounts, they were widely regarded in their circles as faithful ministers and upstanding members of respected Christian families. And they were also directing and profiting from the kidnapping, torture, exploitation, and murder of enslaved people, establishing themselves and their descendants directly on the backs of Black people whose humanity they actively denied. Both those men would eventually leave the Episcopal Church to become bishops in a schism called the Reformed Episcopal Church. Latanay, like most who left for liturgical reasons, disagreed about how to pray. But Stevens left for more complicated reasons. So after the end of the Civil War, the Episcopal Church announced that it was ready to receive Black congregations and that those congregations should put forward their own ministers to be ordained, their own candidates for ordination to lead them. And Reverend Stevens, as these power dynamics were shifting in the Reconstruction era, helped some newly organized Black congregations apply for recognition by the diocese and the right to be seated at convention. And he sponsored 2 Black men for ordination to lead their Episcopal congregations. And mysteriously, those applications to form new congregations somehow never got a vote at convention. And the postulants, no matter how much they studied, were somehow never quite ready for admission to candidacy. And Stevens resigned, frustrated by the blatant institutional mistreatment of those Black Episcopalians and the misalignment between what the church said it was ready to do and how it was actually acting. He encouraged those congregations instead to pursue membership and ordination in the Reformed Episcopal Church, and they did so. And then those same congregations urged him to come with them, and he did. He wrote to the bishop, "In this, I did not feel that I was in the slightest degree disloyal to my church. The church not only had not, but could not comply with its pledges under which these people had sought connection." So he resigned and then moved to the Reformed Episcopal Church to continue to minister alongside those congregations. Remember, Stevens himself still owned slaves and was an officer in the Confederate Army. But for decades after the war, he also demanded that the Episcopal Church make space for and recognize the leadership of Black people. And when it wouldn't do that, he left his job and his church to remain in solidarity and community with them. Ancestors are complicated. And being an ancestor is complicated. So I'm here as an inheritor of all of Stevens and Latine's choices, both their white supremacy and their Christian faith, their support for the Confederacy, their participation in the trade of human life, and in Stevens's case, also his faith that to follow Jesus means being part of something bigger than yourself and your immediate concerns. His faith in God's yearning for a broader, more just, and more open church and world. All of that is reckoned to me and to all of us as siblings in this church. And there's not a day that goes by as we fight for racial justice, as we minister in this church that we love, that we are not responding to the foundations laid by those ancestors, both for good and for ill. Our lives are indelibly shaped by them. Jesus says, "Those who lose their life for his sake will save it." I think that seventh generation thinking is a way of losing the myth that there is any such thing as my life, separate from the history that made me and the history that I am making for others. I don't have a life separate from that complicated web of a massive 112 root tree. But focusing on that tree doesn't devalue life or ask us to sacrifice it lightly. It does the opposite. It honors the incredible impact of a single life, of one person's faithful and faithless acts that define the 7 generations to come. That is what I think Jesus means when he tells Peter to stop focusing on human things and focus on the divine. This is about so much more than your own life, Peter. Connected to an endless web of ancestors and descendants, your life is not your life alone, but is inextricable from all created life. What if in all our decisions and our actions, we could attend to that? Sometimes it might feel like taking up a cross, but most of the time, I expect it feels like being caught up in a sea of something much greater than ourselves, with divine power and divine significance. I think it will feel like following Jesus. So where in your life can you attend to the impact of your decisions on 7 generations ahead of you? And what would that look like? How would that feel?
Yo tengo que traducir todo eso y no creo que voy a poder hacerlo. Magnífico. Buen trabajo, hermana. Pero voy a darles unos puntos claves. El modo que este evangelio se ha interpretado de tomar la cruz, perder su vida, se ha interpretado de un modo que realmente es como que Jesús no evalúa nuestras vidas, como que tenemos que dejar todo y sufrir simplemente por sufrir para estar con Él. Pero la realidad es que es mucho más rico que esto, propone a nuestra proclamadora del Evangelio, que actualmente es reconocer que nuestra vida no es aislada de otros. Introduce el concepto, un concepto antiguo actualmente de los pueblos indígenas de este país, la Confederación, que se conoce popularmente como Iroquois, de 6 naciones que del modo que planeaban, que formaban su futuro para su nación, es pensando 7 generaciones atrás y 7 generaciones enfrente. So pensaban, ¿qué es lo que estas decisiones, cómo van a impactar mis nietos? Estas decisiones, ¿cómo que hicieron mis abuelitos y abuelitas? ¿Cómo están impactando a nosotros? Y esto es algo que importante de tomar en cuenta cuando pensamos no solamente en lo que la historia de Abraham y Sara, que ellos fueron parte de un árbol, que de ellos vinieron por lo menos, nomás de ellos dos, 112 descendientes. No estamos contando todas las ramas y todas las hojas de hermanos, hermanas que se casaron, primos, etcétera, etcétera. Y esto lo expande hasta más Pablo, en la carta de los Romanos, cuando habla de Abraham, no solamente con el antepasado por sangre de ciertos pueblos, pero el antepasado espiritual, padre de todos los romanos que no tenían ni idioma, ni cultura, ni nación, nada étnico, nada en común con esto. Y ella, como una persona queer, dice, yo entiendo esto, que familia es mucho más grande que simplemente la sangre y más complicada. Más complicada porque en familia sabemos que la historia siempre es más complicada en términos de que a veces recibimos una cierta versión sanatizada, limpia, pero es mucho más complicada que eso. Que Sara, por ejemplo, fue cómplice en darle como propiedad a Agar para que fuera abusada esencialmente por Abraham, para que pudiera tener un hijo. O que luego la abandonaron. Ella fue Sara la que dijo, llévala al desierto, sácala de aquí. Son cosas duras que también en nuestras familias hay. Y a la reverenda compartió eso, compartió como en su familia, sus antepasados, sus tatarabuelitos. Tenía 2 que fueron actualmente sacerdotes en la Iglesia Episcopal y luego obispos, pero fueron obispos porque hubo la guerra civil y ellos, como eran del sur, se fueron con la Confederación del Sur. Los 2 eran admirados en su comunidad y los 2 eran también dueños de esclavos. Y los 2 ganar la herencia que ella tiene ahora viene de una historia que incluye la tortura, la matanza, la conquista de gente africana. Pero también cuenta que los 2 dejaron la iglesia, pero por diferentes razones. Uno por razones litúrgicas, pero el otro era más complicado, y sabemos que era más complicado porque después de la guerra, cuando la Iglesia Episcopal invitó una vez más a los obispos que regresaron, y además de eso dijo que ahora gente de la descendencia africana, esclavos, podían ser ahora postulados como sacerdotes en la iglesia, ordenados como sacerdotes. Su abuelito, tatarabuelito Stevens, dijo, pues vamos entonces. Y trató de ayudar a 2 para que se postularan. Y siempre había un problema. No estaban suficientemente preparados. No tenían todo lo que necesitaban. Al fin, este tatarabuelito decidió decirles a esta congregación, a esta gente, a este pueblo, es mejor que se salgan y vayan a la Iglesia Episcopal Reformada. Y ellos, en cambio, le dijeron, pues ven con nosotros. Y lo hizo. Dejó su puesto en la iglesia. Dejó su estatus en la comunidad para ser parte de esto. Todavía no se le quita esto de que fue dueño de esclavos y todo eso, pero él se movió en, yo no sé, nombre del Espíritu, en nombre de la historia, pero se movió a estar al par de esta congregación. La historia es complicada para todos nosotros, de familia. Siempre lo es. Pero también esta historia nos indica qué tan rico, mucho más rico es cuando dejamos nuestra vida privada, en cierto modo, y reconocemos que estamos conectados con todas clases de personas, no solamente por sangre, por la DNA, pero por el Espíritu. Y eso es realmente dejar nuestra vida. Cuando Jesús le dice a Pedro, apártate, estás fijándote solamente en las cosas de hombres. Lo que está diciendo realmente es la visión de Dios es mucho más grande que eso. Tu participación en la creación es mucho más grande que eso. Y la pregunta que nos hace ahora la reverenda es, ¿cómo es que las decisiones, pensamos en las decisiones que hacemos hoy en día y cómo van a afectar estas generaciones, 7 generaciones después? ¿Y cómo fueron que decisiones tal vez, porque no solamente son nuestras decisiones, estas decisiones también fueron heredadas de 7 generaciones atrás? ¿Qué pasa cuando tomamos todo esto en cuenta? ¿Y cómo es que ahora pensamos en nuestras decisiones si decimos, voy a tomar mi cruz y seguir a Cristo? No como pérdida, pero como ganancia.